Alright guys, welcome back to F1 News. Major development in the driver market today occurring during practice for the Japanese Grand Prix. Toto Wolff reveals that one of his chief rivals is just about to sign a top driver on the grid as it stands. This comes amid Fernando Alonso supposedly snubbing any approaches from Mercedes, and Carlos Sainz spotted getting rather chummy with Helmut Marko of Red Bull in the paddock today. Very much into your thoughts in the comments below. Hit the like button if you enjoy. Subscribe if you're new as always, I would greatly appreciate it. First of all, we have some practice to discuss. Lewis Hamilton, by the way, has completely lost the power unit that failed back in Australia. That is to be expected, to be fair. But apparently a bottom end failure of the engine, so what's in the block basically, crankshaft, stuff like that. I don't know. It went kaput clearly, and it is absolutely unsavable, so that it will not be brought back into the pool. Mercedes say not a design problem, but rather a quality process issue, i.e. somebody made a mistake somewhere putting this thing together and it died, and therefore that's all they're going to do. So Hamilton, of course, new engine this weekend for him. That doesn't, it's not the end of the world necessarily. It may mean they need another engine at some point, which would mean, of course, a penalty later in the season. But to be fair, other drivers are also putting a new engine in their car this weekend as well. Maybe they can survive, but it's a long season with lots of races, lots of sprint races as well. Other teams that need to survive in terms of not putting their car in the wall are such as Alpine. We know that Williams, they've been all the rage over the last couple of weeks, and for very good reason, because they didn't have a spare chassis for even, I think, Jeddah and Bahrain, and in Australia it cost them, right, because Albon crashed. They only had one car to go for the remainder of the weekend. It turns out other teams are in a similar boat. Alpine, they don't have one either, so they can't afford either their drivers to put it in the wall, at least put it in the wall badly, as we'll discuss in a second. They will have one from China. There's discussions as to whether Haas and other teams are in a similar boat, and why some of these teams seem so amateurish, to be honest. However, we do have FP1, Ayumu Iwasa, credit to him as well. Of course, he stepped in today for Daniel Ricciardo, and there's lots to say really on Ricciardo in general, actually, because there was this update today from Scott Mitchell-Marm that they will be bringing in a new chassis for Ricciardo in China. Now, RB say, we're not doing this because Ricciardo's been struggling. We've had a new chassis ready anyway, so we're going to give it to Ricciardo. It's a perfectly happy accident. But the rumour has been that Ricciardo feels that he can't find Tsunoda's pace, not because he is inadequate, but because the car is somehow inadequate. So he's going to get a new chassis in China, and then we will really see, I suppose, whether his struggles over the last couple of weeks are skill issues or whether there's something to do with the car. But Logan Sargeant, he put it in the wall again. And this was, man, it's tough. It would be funny if it wasn't so sad in a way for Sargeant, and in some ways it is still kind of funny. But yeah, I don't know how he's managed this. Obviously, he's driving the repaired chassis that the boys back at the factory have spent the last couple of weeks repairing. They said they'd done a great job. It was barely any heavier than it was previously when he crashed it. This was the crash, by the way, coming out of the S's, up the hill. He gets right onto the curb, and then for some reason just doesn't come back on the track. I know that if you guys have played the F1 game, you'd have probably done this many a time. Get too wide here, get on the grass, and end up spinning out, which is exactly what happens. But it's just such a mistake that you can't make. Like, how is he this far over in this position, right? It's just one of those really bad errors. And as Sargeant says, I put the car in a place that I didn't realise where I was at. It was a bit of a silly error, to be honest, one that I shouldn't be making, especially in FP1, and he sounded devastated on the radio, and understandably so. Even James Vowles says it was a frustrating one. He didn't know where he was on the track, which is rather reminiscent of Latifi in Suzuka a couple of years ago when he took the wrong turn at the final chicane. So it's quite clear that Williams don't have much confidence in Sargeant. I'm not sure Sargeant, to be honest, at the moment, has much confidence in himself. James Vowles says, no, he was in a good state of mind. People are also saying, well, Williams, you get what's coming in the sense that you killed his confidence by not giving him the chance to drive the car in Australia, so maybe it shouldn't be too much of a surprise. And maybe there's some truth to that, but at the same time, you know, I think what really killed his confidence was the fact that Albon's been beating up on him every single week for the last couple of years now, and he's obviously been struggling himself. So he's not putting it together. It's just another issue for Williams. More damage as well for Williams to deal with. He crashed here last year as well, Sargeant, right out of the final corner. So not great, and he didn't get to compete in FP2. Now, there wasn't much running at FP2, as we'll discuss in a second, and it hasn't damaged the chassis. It was actually a pretty big crash, to be fair. We can see if I go back to that kind of onboard right about here, like he spins off, goes into the wall. Pretty big crash, but it doesn't seem like it's damaged the chassis so much, but But there are other issues, actually. I think it was reported that the gearbox, the suspension, like there's been quite a lot of damage to fix, but the chassis itself should be repairable, because if it wasn't, then Sargeant ain't racing again this weekend, unless you think that maybe what they're going to say is, well, this time it was Logan that crashed, so Alex, get out of your car, we're going to put Logan in yours, because that's probably not going to be happening, which was Logan's original chassis, to be fair, because they swapped it around somewhat controversially. So, now Aston Martin, they bought some upgrades today, which didn't really seem to deliver that much based on FP1. Alonso was still faster than Stroll, but it was actually only Stroll that had the upgrades, which is always a funny one, really, isn't it? If you're driving for Aston Martin, despite the fact that you might be the fastest driver by a mile, it's still Lance Stroll who gets the upgrades first, which is what we're seeing here. So this is Stroll's car. This is Alonso's car on the left-hand side. You guys can see the differences, for example, in the side pod concept. If I just make it full screen, you guys can see what we're looking at here. So some of the changes they've made to the car visually on this package they have just brought in. However, the other package apparently arrived later in the day, maybe by about now, who knows. So Fernando Alonso will be able to use it for the remainder of the weekend. So we'll see if that actually helps Aston Martin, because last year they brought upgrades, but they didn't upgrade their car, and they certainly need these two if they want to make some strides this season where they currently sit in the Constructors. Red Bull brought some upgrades as well. Helmut Marko says they performed precisely as anticipated, but given the fact that Red Bull have brought a pretty sizable upgrade, few changes to the floor, couple of things elsewhere on the car as well, they didn't dominate the day. They kind of did in some regard. They were P1, P2, but it's not like Carlos Sainz and the Mercedes were miles behind, which is interesting for the rest of the weekend, actually, especially with what Sainz says in a second. And who knows, maybe Sainz is going to be a Red Bull driver in the near future. But Marko actually says this: we are very satisfied. We brought a relatively important update and they worked. Ferrari's long run, though, was really impressive. Leclerc was a second faster. This is not the reality, though. If they use less fuel, which Ferrari likes to do, they are close to us. And there wasn't so much representative running today to look at in the early sessions, FP1 especially, who knows. But still, Ferrari not only have some pretty good one-lap pace, but their long-run pace is now very impressive, especially last week in Australia. And based on the long-run data, Leclerc was the man to beat in FP1 today on that long-run pace. But as Marko says, well, we like to use lower engine modes than Ferrari sometimes do. We like to use more fuel to kind of balance it out than Ferrari sometimes do. But the feeling is that actually, yes, Red Bull are satisfied with their upgrades, but Ferrari really aren't that far behind. And Sainz actually said this after practice: we are closer to Red Bull than I expected. They were only, Sainz was, 0.2 off during the practice session. Verstappen was a 1:30.0, which is actually really fast compared to last year. We can have a look at some of those numbers in a second, but comparing this year's FP1 to last year's FP1, these cars are way faster, and Hamilton and the Mercedes guys certainly felt that as well. So Perez was 0.2 down, Sainz was 0.2 down as well, then it was the Mercedes 4.5, 5 down. Hamilton and Russell right next to each other, as quite often happens when the car is in a reasonably good window. Then Leclerc, then Alonso, Piastri, Tsunoda, Norris running at the top 10. Ayumu Iwasa, of course, Japanese driver for RB, stepped in for Ricciardo, and it's not like Stroll had a good session either, given the fact that Alonso was, well, 1.5 seconds faster than him despite the upgrade. So that might say something, and of course Sargeant didn't get much running in because of his own mistake. Mercedes, though, have a lot to learn here, and actually, Mercedes were incredibly optimistic coming out of this session. But we have seen this before, multiple times even already this year, the optimism from Mercedes that then disappears. But for some reason, and I don't think they understand this, when the temperatures are cold, their car just goes very well. Their car has far fewer limitations when the temperatures are cold, for whatever reason, and I don't think they really know the answer to this question. But this is, for example, Suzuka Practice 1 comparison, 24 versus 23. The cars are all way quicker than last year, especially around this circuit. Ferrari, 2 seconds faster. Aston Martin, 2 seconds faster. Mercedes, 2.8 seconds faster in this year's first practice compared to last year's first practice, because they were a nightmare this time last year. But for some reason with Mercedes, it's a bit of a trend now that they start the weekend kind of well. They didn't do that previously, and usually starting the weekend well implies good understanding of the car, good understanding of the simulation tools, so you can get the setup from, minute one where it needs to be. So for some reason though, Mercedes actually seem to go quite well in the early sessions, but then it falls away from them. So we'll see if this weekend is anything similar. Hamilton says, yeah, great session, really good session for us. It was the best session that we've had so far this year, the best the car has felt this year so far. So really positive, really excited. Given a difficult few races, great work has been done this last week to get us in more of a sweet spot. So I haven't really made any changes since. And this is the funny part, right? Because people, keep roasting Hamilton for making too many changes, because we've seen that the last couple of weekends. The car is good, but not great. Hamilton will mess around with a few things, and then it seems to ruin the car. Russell will take the car that he's given and say, you know what, I'll deal with this. And maybe Hamilton will think, you know what, yeah, let's just stick with this, not make any setup changes for the rest of the weekend to ensure that they remain in the best position possible. And he had this bit of a smirk when he said that I haven't made any changes since then. And maybe he's thinking, all right, if we want to make some changes, maybe it's Russell's turn to try some things on the car, and I'll keep my setup exactly how it presently is, because messing around with things has cost Mercedes in the past, and if the car is feeling good, even if it's still a bit off the pace, I think Mercedes right now would take that compared to what they've struggled with over the last couple of weekends. There is still, though, some concern that in the long run data, they still had some quite severe degradation compared to the other teams. So I guess we'll see how that develops, especially tomorrow in qualifying, and then most certainly Sunday for the Grand Prix. I will mention as well what F1.com say on the quali simulation pace. I never usually mention these stats because I always think they're BS. But I will say that for the first time in some time, they actually seem to have made an effort here to make these accurate, because usually, if you guys have looked at these before, they put the entire grid within like a second of each other. And it's like, come on. We know the race and the qualifying isn't going to be that good. Like, you don't have to fool us, basically. So this is what they say today, that Red Bull and Ferrari are going to be pretty close for pole, which is probably expected, but I would think that Ferrari might be a little bit further back than this. Then McLaren, Merck and Aston all neck and neck. Then RB, and then you've got the teams, effectively, it's tough to even say whether it's back markers or back of the midfield, because they're all in the same boat, really. But Williams, Haas, Sauber and Alpine all well over a second, if not 2 seconds behind on the day we have so far. And yeah, Alpine, shocking as ever, nobody is surprised. But I just thought I'd mention it because usually they try and pull the wool over our eyes with this, but I feel like actually they might have given this a good go today to try and be somewhat accurate. But FP2 didn't last that long. Well, it lasted an hour, but nobody really did any laps. That was because it was raining and there were various different conditions. Piastri put in the fastest lap, Hamilton put in a good lap at the end as well, went out on the soft tyres. Leclerc was P3 actually, with 4 seconds behind, and then Tsunoda and Ricciardo, who did their laps on the Inters, they were, of course, they led the session for some time, then that changed around. The reason why this happened, by the way, and there was no running, is because of a quirk in the rules that has changed this year. So last year, the teams in the FIA decided this, by the way, so they can't blame Pirelli, and Pirelli are telling the FIA, hey, we want to change this back, basically, because that looked bad on us, as did it the entire sport. Effectively, right, you had last year 4 sets of Inters for the weekends, 2 sets of wet tyres for the weekends, but if it was wet on Friday, you got another free set of tyres, another free set of Inters, another free set of wet tyres if you wanted to use them. So basically for circumstances like this, but the teams, believing that tomorrow's qualifying, it could be raining, and certainly that could be the case for Sunday's Grand Prix, they wanted to save their tyres. So now, instead of 4-2 with an extra 3 plus 1, it's now 5-3, but with plus 0. They don't get an extra allocation. So you might have thought, well, perfect conditions to try the Inters, see how the car goes in preparation for a wet Sunday, potentially a wet qualifying as well. But the teams preferred to save all of their tyres just in case, because, a new set of Inters is a big deal in an important qualifying session. They would prefer to do that rather than do like any on-track running. So we didn't see much of it at all, which was a shame, and I think the rules need to be looked at there, and Hamilton said that it's just pretty stupid, but it is what it is effectively. However, we have lots on the driver market to also discuss. So the big talk is, if Red Bull aren't as far ahead as they have been previously, and if that is the case that Ferrari are now closer, next year we could have a serious championship challenge on our hands. Maybe even this year, but I still feel like that is a bit of a stretch. But if that is the case, arguably Red Bull need a second driver closer to Max Verstappen, assuming that he stays. And if he doesn't stay, well, they need to make sure they're signing strong drivers. So Checo Perez says, the situation is we're happy as a team and as a driver. It's only a matter of time before we sit down and try and get to an agreement to extend my contract. But at the moment, that isn't necessarily happening. Liam Lawson as well has been promised. This was actually said on Formula1.com today, even though it's been rumoured now for some time that Lawson was told, look, we're going to get you a seat at RB. Just give us a year to figure out the whole Ricciardo, Tsunoda, Perez situation, then we'll get you a drive. And even F1 today are saying that, he has reportedly been promised a race seat for 2025. So there's that situation to resolve. And then we get what Toto Wolff had to say today. So he was asked the question in the media pen. He wasn't even meant to be here in Japan, but he decided to, which makes me wonder whether there are certain conversations that he was looking to have this weekend with certain drivers potentially. But he was asked the question, have you whittled it down to 1, 2 or 3 drivers? And he says, yes, I have, but I won't tell you what number of drivers. So the rumour is that, okay, let's just look at the overall potential. You've got Kimi Antonelli, you've got Carlos Sainz, you've got Fernando Alonso, you've got maybe Alex Albon, you've got Esteban Ocon, you've got Sebastian Vettel as like an outside chance. Those are like the key drivers you might keep in mind. Mercedes and Toto Wolff supposedly have that down to at least 3, if not fewer than 3, especially with this statement here from Toto Wolff. The driver market is very dynamic. Some of the really good guys are about to sign for some of the other teams. It is much too early for us to commit to a driver, he says. So that's really interesting. What does he mean by this exactly? Some of the really good guys to sign to the other teams. So if they're really good drivers that are about to sign, you've got to assume they're signing for top teams, i.e. Mercedes' nearest competitors. So who are we talking about here? Are we talking about Fernando Alonso, quite possibly, or more likely, are we talking about Carlos Sainz? Let's be honest. Of the drivers that are available and ready to go somewhere, maybe he talks about Hülkenberg to Audi. That's a possibility. That might be the next domino to fall. But otherwise, you've got to think that he's implying potentially Carlos Sainz to go to another team. And it doesn't seem like that's going to be Mercedes. Where else does Sainz go but Red Bull in that case? Or Aston Martin, maybe, but that's where Alonso resides, and it doesn't seem like Stroll is going anywhere anytime soon. And this is when we get these pictures coming out with this fella here in the middle from the German media, I believe. But outside of that, we have Mr. Helmut Marko on the left here of Red Bull, sharing a nice, very amicable, it seems, conversation between the two of them. So, yeah, very interesting to note, isn't it? That Carlos Sainz, having won the race last weekend in Australia, or 2 weekends ago, and being very impressive in doing exactly that. Therefore, his feeling is clearly, all right, so it's time maybe to get me a seat somewhere in Formula 1. At a top team, it doesn't seem like Mercedes is going to be that destination, so where else makes sense but Red Bull, especially with Toto Wolff saying that, well, some of the top guys are just about to sign, from what he's heard, with some of the top teams. You know, we've got to put 2 and 2 together there and come up with something. This was a very strong driver pairing back in the day on Toro Rosso. I would love to see an Alonso Verstappen pairing. I would love to see a Sainz Verstappen pairing. Do I think Verstappen would beat him over a season? Yes. Would Sainz do everything it takes to try and win? Yes, also. And is he a very good driver? Yes. Now, we know that there's drama here between the two respective families. Verstappen and Carlos seem to get on well enough, but Carlos Sainz Sr. and Jos Verstappen, that's a bit of a different story, right? And, we know that from back in the day. If you are Red Bull looking to avoid any of this drama, you wouldn't do this. But if you're Christian Horner looking to assert your authority on the team, assert your authority over Jos Verstappen, assert your authority over Max Verstappen and say, look, Max, you're not going to get it all your own way. Same to Jos as well, after the falling out that they have most clearly had in the public domain. This would be a move that you might well make. So I think this is now looking the more likely angle, to be honest, than some of the others that have come up. I think that Sainz to Red Bull is a very plausible possibility at the moment, especially when we are hearing, because the other option for Sainz would be Mercedes, right? But there's been talk from pretty much all angles that Kimi Antonelli is the man that Toto wants. So what you think about this, is it a good idea or a bad idea, whether you should send him to Williams for a couple of seasons, especially because Sargeant, he ain't staying there on current evidence. Kimi Antonelli doing a solid job in Formula 2. I think the feeling is from Toto and from others probably is that Behrman did such a great job in that Ferrari in Jeddah, given the circumstances. So it's time to put Antonelli in the Mercedes. Now, this might be a big risk, and it might be writing off the possibility of winning a championship that season, depending on your perspective on those respective drivers. But if he's the real deal, he will prove it, and that is the plan. Antonelli as well will start to do some testing in older Mercedes at the end of the month in Austria, starting initially. So he's going to test, I think, the W12 first of all, because Toto said that he wants him to drive an actual good Mercedes firstly. Then he's going to put him in the W13, then probably the W14. They're going to do a big round of testing for Antonelli with the intention, it seems, to put him in the Mercedes next year to replace Hamilton. So that means Sainz to Red Bull makes a fair bit of sense, really, especially if Alonso is apparently saying that he's not interested in Mercedes, which is quite the thing to say. Now, you might say, well, Alonso doesn't have the greatest history, does he, of choosing well in the driver market, so maybe he's missing a trick here. But would I say that he's making a mistake to stay at Aston and not go to Mercedes? Not necessarily as it sounds. That actually sounds like a pretty viable option. So I think Alonso might be thinking, you know what, it's Red Bull or bust for me. Either Red Bull sign me, apparently Horner wants to, but maybe Sainz is a more sensible option. And also if Sainz was to go to Mercedes, even Alonso was to go to Mercedes, I think they would feel like they were a stopgap for Antonelli, as is the plan. So yeah, rumours as of today that imply Alonso staying at Aston Martin makes the most sense. Antonelli to Mercedes and potentially Sainz to Red Bull is the most likely outcomes of what we currently see. But obviously if Verstappen leaves, then it's a very different story. But very much interested in your thoughts on all this stuff in the comment section below. Hit the like button if you enjoyed, subscribe if you're new, take care, and I'll see you next time.